Have you ever felt like you were following something watching you in the dark? What if I told you there's a place where it's not just a feeling, but a reality? A place where every step can be your last, and the doors don't always lead out. Today we're going to tell the story of the House of Shadows, an abandoned building that consumes all living things. Are you ready to find out what this house is hiding? Then follow us, but be careful, you may be among those who never get out. Shadow on the threshold. In a small town, forgotten by time, stood an old abandoned house. The locals called it the House of Shadows and shunned it. For decades, no one had dared to look inside. Sometimes, even on sunny days, the dark windows seemed to be watching passers-by, and in the shade of the trees growing near the house, the air always seemed heavy, as if something was hiding from view. Irina had always loved walking through the old streets. She used to come to this little town with her husband to restore the old library that was in the center. Sometimes she and he would stroll the evening alleys, talking about business and forgotten stories, but to Irina, this town was just a backdrop, not something important. Everything changed that night when she alone decided to explore the place that was the stuff of legends. The noise of the cars had long since disappeared over the horizon, and silence hung in the air. Irina got out of the car and sighed. She knew it would be strange if she didn't visit the House of Shadows, though she didn't believe the rumors. No big deal, just an old building locked up. Or was it? As she walked past, she noticed that her footsteps were suddenly louder. Almost like an echo. Suddenly, a cat darted out from around the corner, uttering some kind of pitiful tirade. Irina was startled and took a step back so as not to frighten the animal, but its eyes seemed to stay fixed on her. The cat seemed to look at her with distaste. The fur on its body heaved, and its gaze was full of some unknown shadow. Irina grinned, thinking that perhaps she needed to rest. Remembering that she was on her way to the cafe, she turned around and was about to go on her way, but footsteps from behind her. Something wasn't right. She turned around. At first, she didn't notice anything. Then, in one of the dark windows of the house, a figure seemed to flicker. A person? Or just a shadow? Irina took a sharp step to the side to get away, but it was as if her body was pinned to the ground. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, though the air around her seemed clean and fresh. Her gaze caught another window. There was no longer just a shadow in it. With each passing second, the figure became more distinct, a tall, dark creature with thin, long arms. It didn't move, but something about its stance made Irina feel a cold, unpleasant sweat break out on her skin. It was as if the very air around her had shrunk. Forgetting caution, she hurriedly took a step toward the house, her hands shaking. But the moment she approached the door, she felt something. The feeling was impossible to describe in words. A coldness that penetrated her to the bone, an unbearable heaviness clutching her chest, and all around her, dark sounds like something alive, creeping and threatening. The door was not locked. Strangely, as if expecting her arrival, it opened on its own. It was dark and damp inside. A dim light was pouring in from behind some crack in the wall, and as Irina approached this source of light, she noticed strange footprints on the floor. They looked like paw prints, but too long and thin, as if someone had crawled across these old wooden planks, leaving behind a residue of dirt and something viscous. Something about this house was alive. Suddenly the door behind her slammed shut with a thud. Irina flinched, her eyes quickly surveying the room. Nothing was visible, only shadows and jagged lines, as if the room itself was warping beneath her eyes. She took a step back, but a shadow appeared in front of her. It wasn't the shadow of an ordinary person. It was someone else. Not a person. Something old. Very old. Irina remembered everything the locals had told her, whoever enters the House of Shadows once will never come out again. Now she understood what they meant. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let her go. The shadows began to move, spreading across the walls and ceiling, obscuring the light. Irina tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. And then she heard a whisper. Her heart beat so hard that it felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. The whisper grew louder, but it was unintelligible, as if someone was speaking from a distant world that was impossible to understand. Irina took a few steps around the room, trying to find a way out, but only those ominous words were spinning in her head like a spell. "You will stay here, forever." Irina clenched her eyes, trying to suppress the panic that was rapidly overwhelming her. Her breathing became rapid and intermittent, as if the room itself was compressing her chest. It was as if she wasn't in an abandoned house, but in some other space where time flowed according to its own laws. Or didn't flow at all. She took a step deeper into the room. Suddenly she noticed how the floor began to be covered with wet spots, small at first, then larger and larger, spreading across the boards like blood, though there was nothing human in their color. Irina swallowed, turning away from the stains, but her eyes returned to them again and again. And with each glance, the stains seemed to become alive, moving, crawling, sometimes stretching out into long, writhing shapes. Forgetting caution, she hurriedly took a step toward the house, her hands shaking. But the moment she approached the door, she felt something. The feeling was impossible to describe in words. A coldness that penetrated her to the bone, an unbearable heaviness clutching her chest, and all around her, dark sounds like something alive, creeping and threatening. The door was not locked. Strangely, as if expecting her arrival, it opened on its own. It was dark and damp inside. A dim light was pouring in from behind some crack in the wall, and as Irina approached this source of light, she noticed strange footprints on the floor. They looked like paw prints, but too long and thin, as if someone had crawled across these old wooden planks, leaving behind a residue of dirt and something viscous. Something about this house was alive. Suddenly the door behind her slammed shut with a thud. Irina flinched, her eyes quickly surveying the room. Nothing was visible, only shadows and jagged lines, as if the room itself was warping beneath her eyes. She took a step back, but a shadow appeared in front of her. It wasn't the shadow of an ordinary person. It was someone else. Not a person. Something old. Very old. Irina remembered everything the locals had told her. Whoever enters the House of Shadows once will never come out again. Now she understood what they meant. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let her go. The shadows began to move, spreading across the walls and ceiling, obscuring the light. Irina tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. She couldn't stand still any longer. She wanted to run away, but she didn't know where. A closed door. A room that had no exit. And the strange, icy whisper that kept penetrating her mind, tearing her thoughts to shreds. It seemed to burst from the very depths of her consciousness and forced her to listen. The shadows in the corners became more and more distinct. At first it seemed to be just a play of light, but now Irina could clearly see figures. People. No. They weren't people. They were something more. And their eyes, dark, deep as bottomless pits, staring at her from behind layers of shadow. Each had its own shape, its own style, its own way of existing in this house. They didn't move, but Irina could feel them watching her every move. Irina took another step toward the exit, but now she felt like she had completely lost her direction. As she tried to move, she increasingly lost her sense of space. The floor shifted, the walls retracted, the ceiling began to bend, as if the house itself was trying to swallow her. The walls began to shift, to distort, creating tunnels and corridors that led nowhere. She turned around and saw one of the dark figures standing against the wall begin to move slowly. It was a creature whose eyes followed her movement unflinchingly. It was not walking. It seemed to absorb the space, the distance between them shrinking with each step. Irina felt a cold breath pass over the back of her neck, as if someone was quite close, but not. Saw it. She turned sharply, shrieking with fear, but she saw nothing. Everything became hazy and blurry. The sound of footsteps. Light and silent, like the rustle of the wind. But she knew it wasn't the wind. "You need to leave," the voice whispered, and Irina realized at once, it wasn't real, it wasn't a human voice. It wasn't a human whisper. The voice came from the house itself, from its walls, from the floor, from the very space that was trying to swallow her up. Irina looked around quickly. Suddenly her gaze caught one detail. There was a massive mirror door in the corner of the room that she hadn't noticed before. She couldn't remember how she had ended up here, but now, as soon as her eyes landed on that door, the rest of the room seemed to dissolve. Everything around it had vanished. Just the mirror. And in it, her own reflection. But something was wrong. Irina's reflection didn't move in sync with her. It stood, motionless, as if frozen in time. Irina could feel the coldness gripping her, and something began to happen in the mirror. First dark cracks crept across it, then they began to widen, as if something was trying to break free. An instant later, Irina's reflection was distorted. His face became, not her face. It was distorted into a monstrous mask, with eyes filled not with life, but with a hollow horror. Irina recoiled, but something in the mirror held her gaze. And the more she looked, the more it seemed to her that someone was behind that reflection. A tall silhouette, just like the ones she'd seen in the corners of the room. Shadows, as if alive, began to emerge from the mirror, spreading across the floor. She could hear their footsteps, their breathing, feel the air growing colder and colder. Her head began to spin, and scraps of thoughts surfaced in her mind. "You're not getting out of here. You're already here. You're part of it." The reflection in the mirror laughed that it wasn't her laugh. Irina instinctively took a step back, but the mirror was no longer reflecting her, but something else. A creature. A creature whose arms were outstretched toward her like claws, eager to touch her. She tried to close her eyes, but the horror stood in her head, in her skin. Her body became absorbent cotton, and everything in front of her eyes began to swim. It seemed that she no longer existed in this world, that her soul was leaving. Darkness consumed everything. At the moment when Irina thought that her mind could no longer stand, when she could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion, something sharp cut through the air. She felt an unknown force pull her sharply behind her, and with that movement the last drop of consciousness disappeared. She woke up in the wrong place. It was still the same darkness, but now it was filled not with shadows but with something else, the cold, unbearably deep, as if she were in the heart of winter, in a place where nothing could survive. Then she heard it, the same whisper. It wasn't coming from around the corner, but straight from her head, as if her mind was consumed by whatever dwelt here. "You're here because you chose. You chose." Her body was paralyzed. She couldn't move or scream. Silently, as if in a slow-motion movie, Irina saw new figures begin to emerge from the darkness, step by step. They were the same creatures she had seen in the mirror, but now they were moving. Unnaturally fluid, their movements resembled not living beings, but phantoms that had lost touch with space. They came closer, their huge, black eyes glittering but reflecting no light. They were empty, like abysses. Irina felt their gaze penetrating her again, encompassing her soul. They stood in the semi-darkness, not touching her, but she felt their presence literally pressing into her. The lips of one of the creatures moved. A slight, unbearably creepy sound. "You weren't supposed to come in here. But now you're ours." A sharp, stabbing chill ran across her skin as her body finally regained the ability to move again. But she was unable to move, unable to scream, and the only thing left was to watch these creatures approach but not touch her. Just standing there, as if they were watching her, will weaken. Irina tried to realize where she was. These walls, these empty eyes. This wasn't the house she'd seen before. This was something else. It was a place between worlds, a border that no living person was supposed to cross. You chose because you knew. You knew everything. Each word echoed in her mind. She couldn't remember what exactly had brought her here. Why had she approached this house? Why had she chosen to explore it despite all the warnings? That question tormented her, but with each passing moment her thoughts became more and more blurred. She couldn't remember what had happened up until the moment she entered this house. The shadows began to move. It wasn't just movement, they flowed into space, forming new shapes. Irina's body was gripped by unimaginable pain. The creatures began to approach, their eyes were now directly in front of her, and she felt their icy grip inside. Not on a physical level, but in her very being, in her very essence. "You're not coming out," came that voice again, as if it wasn't coming from one of the creatures, but from inside her, from her very soul. "You are part of us. You are part of this place." Irina felt her mind begin to fade. As her consciousness fell apart, as her memory faded away, leaving only a sense of terror. The walls that she had tried so desperately, she saw only darkness, a darkness that swallowed her whole. All strength, all emotion vanished like smoke, and finally she realized that she was not even able to resist. And suddenly, silence. Her heart pounded in her chest. Somehow she realized that she was no longer alone. The darkness around her was thickening, but it wasn't frightening now. It had become a part of her. And in that silence, in that heavy, consuming void, she felt her thoughts begin to fade, displaced by something vast and eternal. The power of these beings, their gazes, their merging with her essence was inevitable. "You are already here, Irina. You will stay here forever." The gaze, cold and unblinking, finally touched her. Irina felt her soul merge with this world, her reality no longer existed. She was never found again. Those who tried to find out what happened to Irina heard only strange whispers coming from the depths of the old house. The shadows that stood at its windows remained the same, but now seemed more alive. And anyone who dared to approach the house felt the last spark of reason disappear inside him. The house that had swallowed her up was now waiting for others. As the weeks passed, rumors of the missing Irina began to spread through the town. Locals stopped at the window more and more often, peering in the direction of the old house, but no one dared to come closer. The House of Shadows was more than just an abandoned building, it had become a symbol of something unimaginable that now lay beyond its walls. But not everyone believed the scary stories. Lena, a junior librarian, had been talking to Irina until a few days ago, laughing and joking, and now she couldn't understand how things could have changed so quickly. She didn't believe in otherworldly forces, in ghosts, or in houses that could swallow people up. But Irina's disappearance had left a strange sense of emptiness in her soul, as if part of the world had suddenly dropped out of the picture. One day, as the evening darkness thickened over the city, Lena finally made up her mind. She could no longer live in anxiety, not knowing what had happened to her friend. She went to that very house. Lena didn't like stealthy paths, but she still chose one that evening, the path leading to the back of the house. Her footsteps echoed distantly in the silence of the night. The moon, bright and cold, illuminated the narrow, shrubby paths. With each step Lena felt her breathing getting harder and harder. The air seemed impregnated with something rotten, as if the air itself were full of forgotten pain. As she approached the house, her gaze fell on a window. Unlike the others, this window was ajar. Lena froze. Her heart raced, but she couldn't back away. Remembering Irina's words, she took a step toward the door. Shadows she hadn't noticed before began to move, as if the very ground beneath her feet was beginning to ripple. Lena couldn't understand what was happening to her, but something kept her going. The same strange cold, the same footsteps, as if someone was near but not visible. She pushed open the door. The dark hallway inside was empty. But Lena noticed how her reflection in the glass surface of the door in front of her looked different than usual. A light patina of pale light left some shadows on her face, and her eyes seemed to have lost their expression, becoming glassy. She stepped closer. It was quiet inside. The expected emptiness. But somewhere in the back of her mind flashed a worry that things were not as they should be here. Suddenly, in the darkness, she heard footsteps. The same cold, silent sound that didn't sound like the footsteps of an ordinary person. No. They were the footsteps of those creatures that she thought were merely figments of Irina's imagination. The forces that had prompted her to enter this house were beginning to squeeze her from the inside out. Lena couldn't understand what exactly she was looking for. Why didn't her feet want to obey her? Why did these footsteps feel familiar? She turned, trying not to think about being followed, and saw an old door on the second floor. Lena knew it was the place where something was hiding. There was something there, the answer she had to find. Grasping the banister with difficulty, she began to climb the stairs. The walls were covered in cobwebs and the ceiling looked like it was about to collapse. When she reached the top floor, everything swam in her eyes. This wasn't a building. It was something else. She realized that the house was changing itself, as if it was living its own life. As Lena approached the door, something made her freeze. It was dark inside. Very dark. But for a second, like Irina's, her gaze caught on some movement in the darkness. Almost invisible, but distinct. In the very center of the room stood a table. It was covered with a black cloth, and on it lay old books. But they weren't ordinary books, the pages turned themselves, without touching my hands. Everything swirled, and Lena felt her consciousness begin to slip away, as if she were losing touch with the real world. That voice appeared in her head again, whispering all the same words. You came here because we called you. You chose a path that leads only here. You are ours now. The whispering was unbearable. Lena tried to cover her ears, but the sound was in her head. It was beginning to spread through her thoughts, erasing everything she had ever known about herself. She tried to breathe, but it was impossible. The air felt heavy, as if every breath was driving her into pain. At that moment, the lights on the ceiling were dimly lit. They were small at first, but gradually they began to spread throughout the room, illuminating every corner. Lena saw them, the same creatures that had been following Irina. They were here now. They moved closer and closer, but they didn't approach her. Their eyes looked into her soul, penetrating the most secret corners of her mind. Lena closed her eyes, trying to avoid that gaze, but when she opened them again, she was not alone. The shadows had come for her. But despite her struggles, Lena couldn't escape. She couldn't. They were too strong. And this house was too big. When they found her a few days later, she was standing at that very window. Her gaze was blank and her face was frozen. The locals said she was no longer human. She had become part of the house, part of that darkness, part of those who dwelled there. No one else dared to approach the House of Shadows. He continued to wait. This story, like those who ever went in there, became part of the night.